Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Dora Muhammad, Congregation Engagement Director at the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, and I am so very excited to be kicking off my new virtual reflection series, Faith, Race, and Truth. Joining me today for my first chat is the illustrious Reverend Dr. Corey D.B. Walker. I think I made him blush. He is president of the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation. We are also blessed to have him as one of our board members here at the Virginia Interfaith Center. He also serves as a professor of humanities at Wake Forest University. So I had said in my intro, his mind is brilliant and his heart is exceptional. And so before we begin with my questions, a brief overlay. I will be posing questions to him, and then we'll take questions at the end. We'll be talking about faith, race, and faith, justice, and reconciliation, then delve into faith and race, and then delve into faith, race, and truth. And so before we begin, Dr. Walker, can you open us up, please, with a prayer or recitation or a reading?
Okay, thank you so much, Dora, and thank you for allowing me or inviting me to join you today. I'd like to open up with reading from Howard Thurman's wonderful pamphlet, Mysticism and the Experience of Love. It's one of Thurman's more profound and reflective statements where he's actually reflecting on the lessons of mysticism, particularly his journey with Rufus Jones. And it was a lecture that he gave in 1961 at Pendle Hill. And in that lecture, he writes these words: "We are accustomed to thinking of the imagination as a useful tool in the hands of the artist as she reproduces in varied forms that which she sees beyond the rim of fact that encircles the world around her. There are times when the imagination is regarded as a delightful and often whimsical characteristic of what we are pleased to call the childish mind.
Mm.
But the place where the imagination shows its greatest powers as the angelos, the messenger of God, is in the miracle which it creates when one individual, standing in his place, is able, while remaining there, to put herself in another person's place, to send his imagination forth to establish a beachhead in another individual's spirit, and from that vantage point, so to blend with the other's landscape that what she sees and feels is authentic. This is the great adventure in human relations."
Absolutely beautiful. Absolutely deeper and beyond, more than empathy, more than compassion. I love that. Thank you for sharing. Perfect, perfect. As we're talking about race relations and faith relations. So let's dive right in.
Okay.
So the first question I have for you is when we look at the work of reconciliation and we talk about that in relation to faith and justice, is reconciliation a goal or aspect of justice? Is reconciliation a wholly embodied, separate, independent work that needs to be done? Or is it a prerequisite or a product of justice? Where is it in that spectrum?
It's interesting the way you phrase your question. It's underwritten by a temporality, linear temporality. Either it is first or it's last, and the temporality begins from a beginning to an end. How I like to think about reconciliation is not just within the temporal realm, but reconciliation as a state of relation, a process of engaging, a process of living, and a process whereby we're constantly renewing the bonds of solidarity, the bonds of friendship, and most importantly, the bonds that connect us with the world and all of God's creation. So if we think of reconciliation, I like to think of it as truly a holistic process where we're constantly engaging and refining and redefining ourselves, redefining the very nature of our relationships, and redefining the ways in which we exist, the modes of sociality in our communities and in our personal lives, so that we continue to strive toward becoming the kingdom of God.
Mm. This continual work, is it, how does it connect to justice? Because, and I think, yeah, before I go deeper, explain in your
Mhm.
mind, how does that, because I think it's beautiful, this continual redefining and renewal.
Mhm.
And in this, the Western hemisphere and Western kind of concepts of justice, justice is considered like in terms of a court of law, and it is like a resolution and a situation. So how does that merge with this continual renewal?
Well, you can't disaggregate the very mechanisms of how we uh, deliver justice in the everyday, the court of law, the ways in which we treat the immigrant, the ways in which we treat one another, the ways in which we think about modes of solidarity with our fellow human being, whether it be a fellow citizen within a polity or the collective of humanity. It's not an either or.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, what you try to do is you move and strive toward aligning those institutions, those processes, the ways in which we administer justice to this overarching vision of reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
That justice is not a singular destination, but it is a continual way of life. It is how we're constantly striving to define and become better individuals,
I love it.
live in a society that affirms the worth, value, and dignity of all of humanity, and the ways in which we attempt to reconcile ourselves with all of God's creation.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot extract one aspect of justice from the totality of all of existence. When we think of it in the singular realm, or when we try to curtail it to the dictates of the nation state,
Yes.
a mode of political sovereignty,
Mm-hmm.
then we prematurely arrest the development of justice. So what I like to do is begin to really take into account that idea of justice as a flow. Let justice
Yes.
flow as righteous waters and
Yes.
as a mighty stream.
Yes.
Justice is continual. It will look different and manifest itself in different ways across space and time. It will, of necessity, have to change to the very dynamics and the deep diversity of humanity. And I'm reminded of my dear teacher, Cornel West, when he makes his wonderful statement that justice is what love looks like in public.
Yes.
It
Yes.
is the way in which we constantly renew ourselves, renew human relationships, and renew the depth of community across space and time.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that. I hope everyone's buckled up because we just got Reverend just came out there. I love it. And a follow question is that there's a debate, like a real hot debate, with and so with me, I studied truth and reconciliation when I was studying human rights law. And so there is sort of this civic space, where people conceive of reconciliation. But of course, we're a faith-based advocacy, organization. And so with yourself as well at the center. So from a faith perspective, there's this debate between using the word reconciliation versus conciliation, because it's a sort of a manufacturing of, well, Black people ain't never really had a good relationship since we've been on these shores of this land, so there's nothing to reconcile. It's conciliation, should be conciliation. But reconciliation has so much bloom in the faith experience from the sacred space. And I want you to really talk to me about that, sort of from a faith-based perspective. Why is it important that we use reconciliation as the framework for this justice work?
Well, reconciliation really reminds us of the very contingency of the relationships and the ways in which our society exists today. I'm reminded of the old nationalist saying that if you begin your history in 1619, then everything looks like progress. And of course, the history of New World Africans does not begin with the landing of the first enslaved Africans in British North America and Fort Monroe, Virginia in 1619. Our history is the history of humanity that begins with in the beginning. And
Mhm.
when we think of the long arc of not only
Mhm.
human history, but planetary history, then we
Mhm.
understand that reconciliation is an appropriate framework to not only reconcile ourselves to one another, but reconcile ourselves to a broad fulfillment of God's creation. When we begin to engage in that framework, we understand that the work that we're undertaking is not only the work of a contingent set of relationships that have ensued in the moment of modernity, the ways
Mhm.
in which we organize our societies, the ways in which we think about our world, the ways in which we have expanded or atrophied the human imagination in light of uh, in light of our modern experience cannot encapsulate, cannot capture the density and the depth and the variety of human experience across space and time. Even our experiences in the United States and in the Americas.
Mhm.
I'm often reminded that when we tend to think about reconciliation, we take a very narrow view of it.
Yes.
We think of it purely between black and white, and we have this
Yeah.
wonderful space we call the Americas. We're dealing with a number of indigenous populations. And as New World Africans, we are always connected to continental and diasporic Africa. We're connected to, as my dear departed friend Anani Jorginho reminded us, it is global Africanity. It is the ways in which we begin to engage in the world. So I don't want to atrophy our existence to a point in time, nor do I atrophy our humanity
Mhm.
to a singular dimension. Our humanity is the humanity of a gift that is given to us in the beginning, and it is a gift that is global. So
Mhm.
when you think of the ways in which the global freedom struggle in the US
It's all
in the
connected.
20th century
Mhm.
connected with the global freedom struggle
Mhm.
in Asia, on the continent of Africa, and throughout the Americas and Europe,
That's
we'll
powerful.
realize that that freedom struggle, that idea is not just singular. It's not
Mhm.
tethered to one particular moment. It is open to new possibilities. And that is those are the possibilities that's animated by an imaginative, faithful understanding of human existence and planetary possibility.
That is beautiful. Can we write a book about that? Okay, but my family is from the Caribbean, and so I that that interconnectedness, and even when I've traveled, in Africa and in Central America, doing work, it like you see yourself, and so
Yeah.
that when you talk about not atrophying the imagination, like it does open up so much more possibilities of the power of humanity when you're actually engaging in other spaces other than the narrowness of the states. Happens
And
all the time.
and when you think about it, I mean, just I was in one time I was in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and what we were doing in Buenos Aires was really connecting with a series of indigenous groups and social formations on the ground, and beginning to rethink how we can imagine the space of the university as a space of possibility for all humanity. And
Yes.
in that, and in this space, we were drinking mate in a circle, all from a single cup. And as we were sharing our ideas, possibilities. We were all sharing tea in a cup, in a circle, from one single cup. And here I am,
I love it.
New World African from the United States, going down to Buenos Aires, going down to Argentina, recognizing and picking up on the protests of the piqueteros, recognizing the deep disparities between rich and poor, understanding that the River La Plata is a river that is covered with the blood of
Yes.
Africans who were coming into the Americas, and then beginning to look at what new possibilities are possible in relation to indigenous knowledges, indigenous sciences, and the ways in which we can create and connect new possibilities globally. That vision, although it was set in a university context, but that vision really opened up new possibilities of human being and belonging, and really spoke to my faith tradition, but also the faith traditions and the religious orientations of everyone in that circle, regardless of where they come from on the faith spectrum or without faith. And that's the true beauty. That's the
Yes.
power of
Yes.
imagination that Thurman speaks of. And that's really the power of imagination that can propel ideas of reconciliation to
Yes.
push us beyond the boundaries of what we think of in sort of these singular, isolated, episodic instances
Yes.
to a true planetary humanism that really encompasses all of God's creation.
That is awesome. Just okay, I wrote down so many things. Okay, so and I feel like okay, so we need to shift to talk about faith and race, and I hate it because we are so narrow in this context in the States and in the work. So I apologize to everyone because I just feel like we about to take like a left turn from this beautiful, imagine I should have asked these questions last, is what I'm feeling like. But
we'll be okay. We'll be
okay.
okay. We're on a good path.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, help me, guide me. Okay, so this is, for me, part of the racial equity team, so people understand even the concept of why I'm even having this series and why I felt this series was important. As I'm engaging congregations who are beginning to do and discern their racial equity work or what racial justice will look like for their congregation, it's a part of my responsibility to really help foster that space for them. And so it was important to really delve into these concepts. But part of that is the fact that we've been lied to for so long in this country. And so we don't really know history. And so that's why I feel like now we got to go into the darkness after we've been like riding this light. And so, but the darkness of this country's history and what it has actually done is so hidden and obscured that when you begin to have solutions that are bold, like we just talked about, it seems so foreign, it seems so far away. So I just kind of wanted to lay some foundational kind of historic markers of sort of internal and external kind of justifications that Christianity did to uphold white supremacy in this country. Because I tell people all the time, even what we experience, like the slavery here, it's different. It's a whole totally different concept of what America did versus slavery in other countries when you know what's done in other countries. So can you talk to us, bullet point or highlight, however you feel compelled, just some of the historic and contemporary sort of Christian doctrines or practices that justified the darkness of imperialism, chattel slavery, genocide, that experience here in this country?
That's a huge question, Dora,
Yes.
but it's a question that we can wrestle with a simple idea, and that is that the first shift to begin to explore the African coast, both West Africa and East Africa. Sometimes we forget about some of the first enslaved Africans to come to New England were from the East African slave trade, from the East African coast. Those first ships in the late 1400s and throughout the 1500s flew under the flag not of any sovereign nation state. They flew under the imprimatur of the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
And when we begin to think that the idea of slavery was not just the question of political sovereignty, it was also the question about the sovereignty of God. Then we begin to understand that religion, Christianity, a particular Catholic Christianity is part and parcel of the transatlantic slave experience.
Mhm.
So we cannot disentangle the ways in which we think about slavery from the ways in which we think about our religious experiences, particularly Christianity. Once we recognize that the sovereignty of the nation state rests on a conception of the sovereignty of God, and that idea of God as sovereign being that authorize, legitimate the hierarchies of human beings, and then legitimates the ways in which we treat human beings, we recognize that we must not only decolonize our political formations and our political ideas, we must decolonize our theological frameworks, and ultimately, we must decolonize God.
Mm.
When we say that, that means
Yeah,
that
go
our
deeper.
traditions, rituals, institutional ways of being and knowing have to then reflect a new and fresh understanding of God's experience within humanity and ours and humanity's experience within God. It is not a fiat accompli that that God has spoken and God has stopped speaking. No,
Yes.
God continues to speak. And there is a challenge for the Christian church as well as our Abrahamic faiths to
Mhm.
begin to re examine not only our traditions, rituals, theologies, and our institutions,
Mm.
but we must also begin to reimagine and reconsider and reorganize our societies, our cultures, and our ideas. In many ways, it's challenging us, particularly in the Christian church, and I'll speak for my fellow Christians. The idea that a good church can exist in an unjust world is an oxymoron.
Mm.
The
Come
church is
on.
not isolated from the world.
Yes.
Instead, the church is called to exist in the world and transform the world. Thus, the church, as it transforms, becomes a transforming agent of the world. So, those initiatives for justice that individuals in faith communities launch in the world must also refract back into the church. And we will see new orientations for how churches and communities of faith are organized, new ways in which we organize our worship services, our theologies, our faith traditions, and new ways in which we begin to organize how we begin to engage in these ideas across space and time. It is
Yeah.
not a one dimensional direction. It is not, I'm going to hold my church over here and the
Yes.
way it has been
Yes.
for centuries,
That's it.
and then the world will change. No,
That's it.
the church will change and the world will change. Either that will happen or nothing will happen, and we will continue to live in an unjust world where far too many individuals face an unjust life, not of their own choosing, but because we refuse
Mhm.
to transform and change our ways of existing in the world. There's nothing stopping us but ourselves in this regard.
That's it. When you started talking, so I wrote down a couple of things just to delve a little bit deeper. One of the challenges that I heard in what you were saying was, and it was real powerful when you were talking about decolonizing not just the political space, but our theological spaces and decolonizing God Himself. It's like, it's not only sort of the framework that we use for our religious and faith worship, but so much of our faith is how we identify ourselves. So you're actually talking about reimagining ourselves as human beings, and that is a challenge for folks. So I wanted you to talk about that, sort of the decolonization challenges, like when you, because now it's like, oh, it's like what you say about my mama, like you can't be talking about God. You can't be, like you asked me to change what my family, my grandmother raised me on, like what. And then the other piece that's attached to that is when you talked about really the construct of these faith institutions and how it exists in the world in relationship to the world. It's been for faith, many faith institutions and houses of worship. It's an exclusionary presence. And it's like, it's a sense of exclusivity in establishing its own self as a community. It is who is among us that belongs to us. And then everyone else is other. Everyone else is heathen. Everyone else is going to hell. Everyone else is, is tragic. We're the ones that saved, and we're the ones, the holiness is ascribed to us. And even with multiple denominations in a faith tradition, it is heartbreaking when I think about it. And so I just wanted to kind of delve deeper into that. Like, how do we break those kinds of it's bondage, really, because it keeps you locked into isolation. It keeps you locked into, and you never can reach the transcendence of humanity that we were talking about. That's essential to be able to envision decolonizing God. You won't even have the conversation.
Yeah. No, you're right. In this sense, this is some very difficult and tough work. It is not something that's easy. It's not something that's episodic. It can't be just a single idea or a single program. It can't be a single initiative. It requires a totality of all of our being. And here is the challenge within that. And this is why it's beautiful to open up with Howard Thurman's wonderful lecture, Mysticism and the Experience of Love. Thurman reminds us that the greatest leap of imagination is taking ourselves and giving ourselves over to the other, over to another human being, opening up ourselves to the density and depth and variety of that which is other, to truly host it, meaning we're not trying to assimilate it to a logic of the same. We're not trying to assimilate it within our own existing horizons. We're not trying to assimilate it with our pre-existing cognitive schemes or our theoretical formulas or our frameworks. It is truly hosting and welcoming and placing ourselves at risk for transformation by welcoming that which is other. That is the true challenge that's confronting the faith community in our moment. Generally, we want to hold on to those traditional formulations and ideas that are ossified by the accretions of tradition. What we're arguing and what we're trying to push forward is a new and fresh understanding of how those ideas manifest themselves in the lives of those who've gone past in our faith traditions and those yet to come. Like Ayikwe Ama, the beautiful ones have yet to be born. So we know that there's an openness that will come after us, that there's a freshness that must come after us. But we also recognize that when our ancestors in the Americas sang that spiritual, before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. They were articulating an entirely new sense of being human in the world. And in a critical sense, we have lost that ability to imagine a process of a new human being born in the world. And when we begin to undertake that process, those experiences and ideas fall fresh on us in a new way. We become, in that sense, new humans. This is where we make really great friendships and modes of solidarity with our colleagues in the academy and our colleagues in deeply radical and revolutionary traditions, like Prince Fanon, who's pushing and urging us to take up the mantle of a new human.
Yes.
Take up the cross, it is becoming a new human. We have to take that seriously. When we do that, then these possibilities of new organizational, institutional, theological, political, and cultural arrangements come to the forefront. And they don't come to the forefront in the absence of our particularity, but they
Yes.
come to the forefront in and through the depth and density of our particularity. We begin to engage in the ways in which New World Africans connected knowledges from the continent,
Mm.
knowledges in the Americas to fashion New World ways of being that then open up planetary possibilities for a modality of plenitude for the global world. But we are not imperial
Mm.
in the sense that we have the answer. We then place ourselves
It's
to
important.
welcome those others from across the world to the very storehouse of the depth and variety of humanity to open up new possibilities for human beings and for planetary existence. I don't want to
That's
imperialize my
powerful.
experience to my colleagues, the dear
That's right.
farmers who are fighting over in India right now. I don't want to imperialize my experience to those courageous freedom fighters in Myanmar at this moment. I want to learn from them. I want to be in solidarity with them, to begin to struggle
That's
with them
correct.
so
Mhm.
that we can create a new world together. I don't want to imperialize my experience in the Americas as a New World African with my continental brothers and sisters, with our brothers and sisters right now in Dakar, Senegal,
Yes.
who are struggling and wrestling and continuing that freedom struggle. In a sense, what we're seeing globally is the emergence of new modalities of being human. We have to welcome that with the density of our theological traditions, meaning re-examine them. Don't become beholden to a
Yes.
singular mode of being human, but a variety of ways of being human. This comes right home to us and welcoming our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, our trans community, which is under such tremendous attack in this particular moment,
Persecution. That's
ways
right.
in which we identify with our immigrant communities who are not who are coming to the United States because of global inequities
That's right.
perpetuated by the policies of empire. We have a deep responsibility to cultivate, nurture, and give birth to those forms of the new human, and in
Mhm.
the process renew ourselves, our institutions, and our cultures. It's an audacious task. It is not something
Just a
that's
little
set
bit.
up for a singular lifetime, but
Yes.
instead, we join the stream of freedom fighters
That's so
from
important.
the beginning that continue that struggle for a more humane, more just, and more planetary, more just existence for all of the human community, as well as for all of the world.
No, that's so important because people do want these short, quick fixes and
Yeah.
want to feel like we have accomplished something in my lifetime and at my hands. And you just really opened it up and released that kind of unfair burden. So, one of,
And you're doing it. I mean, the thing about it is, it's being done each and every day.
mm-hmm,
It can be the conversation, this
mm-hmm,
conversation,
mm-hmm,
what you're doing at Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, what congregations are doing, but it's
mm-hmm,
within a larger construct. It is
exactly.
not the perpetuation of just a singular vision. It
That's
is the
right.
perpetuation of this expansive imagination. And I think that is the key that we have to always keep hold on, and that's the vision that propels us going forward into the long future.
That's beautiful. Before we take some questions, I want to bringing the element of truth telling into this paradigm that we've talked about here. This is wonderful. I hope everyone's enjoying it as much as I am. I'm trying not to be all giddy. But there's also, so there's this, what's the word? It's not a conflict necessarily, but a sort of a duo, like a dance that between storytelling and truth telling. And so, me being a writer, I love storytelling, but also as a documentary photographer, I love truth telling. And so, want to just talk about that distinction and the relationship of both in this work of reconciliation so people can understand the value of each and sort of what the weight of what truth telling means.
Yeah, this is there's so much wrapped up in these ideas, ideas of narrative and ideas of truth, and often what we realize, even in those narrative moments, is that the narrative requires us to submit to the limits as well as the possibilities of language. Truth requires us to then submit to the possibilities that our truths are partial, they're biased, and they can actually be wrong. But all too often in each, what connects each is not only that element of submission, not only that element of humility, that sort of ethical posture of humility, it is the idea that we then want to imperialize the singular, that singular narrative, that singular truth over and against all other possibilities of truth or all other possibilities of narrative or of narration. What connects us in this moment is in many ways, instead of challenging the very singularity of the narrative or the singularity of truth, we want to exchange one imperial imposition of narrative for the dominant one and one imperial imposition of the truth for the dominant one. What we have to recognize is truth is plural as narratives are plural. In that space, then we begin to recognize that a singular modality of truth then does tremendous violence to the multiplicity of truths out there. I'll give you an example of this. When we begin to think of the narratives of Black lives as being this singular truth, that Black life begins in this sort of destitute situation, and it is yet to be fulfilled by the American nation state. That singular truth evades all of the other truths that first, Black life doesn't begin in 1619. That Blackness is not tethered to the worth, value, and dignity of Blackness is not tethered to the American nation state. It is inherent in humanity. It is inherent in Black life from the beginning. It is inherent in the very idea of Africanity. It is inherent in the ways in which we connect with continental and diasporic Africans, and that cannot be taken away. It also evades the very way in which we allow other individuals to determine the worth, value, and dignity of Black life. So Blackness becomes determined by the way in which it is accepted by the imperial dictates of empire. And instead, what we're finding throughout all of the history of Black existence, through all of the history in the New World, is the affirmation of Black dignity, of Black humanity, and the affirmation that the empire cannot determine the ways of Black solidarity, the ways of Black community, the ways of Black lives, nor the ways in which we begin to organize and reorganize our world. So those truths have to become emergent. Those truths have to become ascendant, and those narratives have to then become ascendant. Imagine if we, instead of narrating Black existence in the United States from the White Lion and the Treasurer arriving in August and September of 1619 in Fort Monroe, imagine that we began in 1521 with the Christmas Day Rebellion of Africans and Indigenous Americans on Hispaniola. Or imagine if we began the story in 1526 in South Carolina of the rebellion of Africans and Indigenous Americans in beginning to strive for a new world existence. Imagine what those two
Let's
dates
go back.
do in
Yes.
configuring the global imagination and configuring our imagination about Black life, about the possibilities of community, about the possibilities of the nation state, and then how we begin to rethink the long struggle for freedom and dignity throughout this context. This doesn't obviate the ways in which we have to tell truth about white supremacy. I mean, Du Bois said this back in 1920 in Dusk of Dawn, that white supremacy was global, it's
Yes.
worldwide. That isn't anything new. The question is, how do we begin to fight? And Black Lives Matter in this moment connects with those long freedom struggles.
Historic.
The,
Yes.
the affirmation of I am a man in the modern Black freedom movement, the affirmation of Sojourner Truth, am I not a woman?
A woman.
Am I not a woman? The connection with those
That's correct.
enslaved Africans and in the 18th century, am I not a man and brother? And of course, those enslaved rebellions in 1521 and 1526. We realize something that is quite new, that there are regimes that are tethered to denying the dignity and the variety of the human. And there are always already regimes that are articulating new modalities of being human each and every day. And these new modalities then give us fresh eyes, fresh ears, and fresh knowledges to begin to rethink our theological traditions, our religious institutions, as well as our religious rituals, to begin to reflect the vision that we're struggling for in our contemporary moment.
I'm just amazed. But yes, there's so much um, just a widening, of just the lens of how we see things. I was wondering, just my last question, and then we'll take some
Mhm.
questions from the attendees. If there is in the present sacred text, and again, it could be in the Bible, it could be a hymn, because you reach back to, again, being from the Caribbean, I know the history of when the Spanish embarked on this and the Portuguese embarked on this. So much of our stuff is constructed from when England first encountered this land and the natives. And so a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, like people don't really know, like they don't know. So I was there's so much twisting of it. And I was wondering, is there a sacred text that exists now that supports or that really speaks to the dignity and the variety of the Black person that you just talked about, sort of that, and you talked about it earlier, we're talking about a space that cultivates and nurtures this kind of new understanding. I think so much of our sacred text has been misused and abused to justify dehumanizing us. And I'm wondering, and it causes so many people to walk away from faith or not even trust people of faith to be in this work altogether. And so I'm wondering, is there sort of, I don't know the right word is redemption of the sacred text of Christianity, but like,
Yeah.
is there a text? Can you share something with us? And this is the beauty that I love doing in this interfaith work. Can you share a text with us from Christian faith that supports and really undergirds and affirms the respect and the humanity of Black people? And really just Indigenous people, just that's,
Yeah.
okay.
I think there are multiple texts in
Mm-hmm.
that regard. I mean, it's littered throughout the Christian tradition. What we have to do is then begin to rid ourselves of this sort of master-slave dialectic
Mm-hmm.
that really organizes the ways in which we think about both Old Testament scriptures as well as New Testament scriptures. We see this master slave motif throughout. God is master, humans are
Yes.
slaves.
Mm,
Once we jettison that particular framework,
mm,
we can begin to look anew as to how communities begin to relate to the divine in the circumstances in which they find themselves, and then how we must relate to the divine in the circumstances in which we find ourselves. we may look at in the Islamic tradition, I'm reminded of Al-Ghazali's treatise on tolerance, and my
Yes.
dear brother Sherman Jackson, who holds the King Faisal Chair in Islamic Studies at USC, has done a remarkable and beautiful and elegant translation of that text.
Mm.
When you begin to look at the ways in which Islam opens up a dramatic tolerance for different cultures, people,
Universal.
ideas, and faith traditions, you realize that the ways in what we attempt to impose on the text
Mm.
then limits the possibilities of the text. And of
Yes.
course, when we begin to think through our Jewish scriptures and the ways in which scripture and text form our Jewish communities, it is the way in which we relate to those texts and how those texts are living texts within the lives of communities and how they form and shape us. So, just within the Abrahamic tradition, what we're seeing and what we can understand is that the texts themselves lend us new opportunities to begin to be formed and shaped anew by these texts and the ways in which we begin to interpret and understand and form our faith communities as a
Mm.
response to the text,
Mm.
as well as a response in our communities, and then as a response to the conditions of human beings in the world.
That's beautiful.
There's no longer any way in which we can maintain a dominant, hegemonic, imperialistic reading of these sacred scriptures in light of all that we know about the world, all that we know about human existence, and the multiple planetary crises that we face in our contemporary moment. It is a way in which we want to hold idolatrous, a
Mm.
dominant and dominating view of these textual traditions to uphold regimes of injustice and regimes of dishonesty and regimes of
Mm.
inhumanity. It's
Mm.
not the text,
It's.
it is the ways in which
Mm.
we approach and
Mm.
engage the text.
I
The
love it.
are also not only the texts don't just stop speaking, nor do they encapsulate the absolute completeness and fullness of God. Just like
Mm.
today, we began
Yes.
with Howard Thurman. There
Yes.
are other texts,
Yes.
and there are other traditions that can inform the ways in which we engage the world and can deepen our individual and our collective faith journeys in our traditions as well as in the community of faith traditions that continue the dialogue. There is no one faith community, no one faith tradition that can encapsulate the majesty, the humanity, and the
Absolutely.
utter divinity of God. And, and, notice we use the conjunction
Yes.
and the deep diversity of humanity
Humanity.
and God's creation.
It's.
That's an ongoing story. That's an ongoing narrative. And that's the power that we begin to harness each and every day as we open ourselves up to the beauty and significance of the other.
That's beautiful. As you were speaking about that, and this is my last thought, and then I'll take some questions. So if you have
Mhm.
questions, go ahead and put it in the Q&A. A verse in the Holy Quran came to me, expand for me my breast, and it just, anyway, so I just feel so expanded, but that it talks about that word, that sort of that space of the connectivity and the how do you cultivate that? It just you just opened us up so much today with your wisdom. So thank you, thank you,
There are,
thank you.
there are people who are not of this fold, and I will bring them also. This
Yes,
is in the Christian tradition.
yes, my
There's
sheep.
always these
Yes,
openness. There's
yes,
always an openness.
it
And
is.
and the thing that we have to do is really uh, deepen that openness and also recognize that the text does not encapsulate the totality of God. These texts remind us of a community's experience, and we read our experiences in and through these texts, but we also read our experiences in and through other texts, other traditions, and other ways of being and knowing in the world.
I love it. I absolutely love it. So we have one question. How do we begin to deal with the indoctrination of the Bible as the singular word of God in our religious culture? We kind of touched on that.
Yes, that's a huge one.
Yes.
And this goes to how we adjudicate between your question between narrative and truth. And
Yes.
there are there are folks who say, well, the Bible as spoken, as written, is the truth. It is the absolute truth. And the problem with that is just raising up of a reflective understanding that the encapsulation of the totality of God's existence, and if we posit that God is infinite and that God is this being that not only emanates God's self in creation, but continues God's self beyond creation,
Mm.
then we as humans have to begin to deal with a contradiction deep at the heart of faith. How do we, as finite creatures, finite beings, encapsulate the totality of knowledge about the infinite?
Mm.
That 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 idea, that contradiction, obtains itself only within a particular logical framework and a logical episteme, or a theory of knowledge, if you will. We recognize those limitations on human knowledge, that knowledge is constantly developing, flowing, and arriving at new possibilities each and every day. The ways in which we know today were not the ways in which we know and engage the world 100 years ago,
Mm.
1,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago. If we recognize that idea of change, but we also recognize that we want to engage in an ethical consideration and an ethical orientation to other human beings and to God's creation, that means we have to wed our theory of knowledge with our ethical formula. So we want to wed our epistemology and our ethics. In so doing, it means we engage and approach text with that new framework in mind. It is not to say that this is the only truth. No one will speak of a singular truth over one's existence from the time they were an infant to the time in which they are entering into the last stages of life. Instead, they see an evolution of truth. How do we then thematize that across the text? How do we then institutionalize it in our churches?
Yes.
How do we then institutionalize it in our institutions of learning? How do we then institutionalize it in the ways in which we model faith journeys in the everyday? So it's not just let me decolonize the
That's right.
text. It's not just
It's not in
decolonizing the
isolation.
church.
Mhm.
It's decolonizing society. It's decolonizing our cognitive frameworks. It's decolonizing the ways in which we engage one another in the everyday. It's decolonizing our political frameworks. It's decolonizing the ways in which we want to instrumentalize our environment. It's decolonizing the very cognitive grids in which we engage the world each and every day, and decolonizing those institutions. So it's not just a singular act. It is multiple, it is holistic, and it is planetary. That's how we get to that moment.
That's it.
And it's part and parcel of a lifetime commitment to this way of existence and being in the world, much like the work that you're doing each and every day, Dora, through the conversations and through your advocacy and through your faith journey and the ways in which that has transformed you and your community.
Thank you for that. Actually, I was trying to avoid tearing up as you were talking because I was filled with so much gratitude thinking about your dedication and devotion of your life. So clearly it's mutual in this space and time. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so humbled by this time with you this morning. And I really hope that everyone listening got something from it and will continue. Definitely, I see people put some comments in. They need to go back and study it. Yes, you have really blessed us so much. Thank you. And I just wanted to give you the floor, the last moment to close us out with a thought or recitation, another reading, I believe, from the book that you have. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you, Dora. This has been wonderful. It's always good to engage in conversation and community. It has enabled me to be transformed, to bring new ideas to life through questions and beginning to reflect. And I like to end with a statement again from Howard Thurman's wonderful Pendle Hill pamphlet, Mysticism and the Experience of Love. And Thurman provides us an elegant ending for our conversation today. Thurman writes, whence comes this power, which seems to be the point of referral of all experience and the essence of all meaning? No created thing, no single unit of life can be the source of such fullness and completeness. For in the experience itself, a person is caught and held by something so much more than she can ever think, or be that there is but one word by which its meaning can be encompassed. That one word is God. Hence, the psalmist says that as long as the love of God shines on us undimmed, not only may no darkness obscure, but also
Mm.
may we find our way to other hearts at a point in them beyond all weakness and beyond all that is good and beyond all that is evil. There is no thing outside ourselves, no circumstance, no condition, no vicissitude that can ultimately separate us from the love of God and from the love of each other. And so we pour out gratitude for God that this is so.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone, for joining us.